Have you ever wondered what goes through someone's mind in their very last moments behind bars? So far, in 2025, 15 inmates across 6 states have faced the ultimate sentence, each with a story as haunting as it is heartbreaking. In this video, we'll dive into the chilling last words they spoke on the gurney and the surprising final meals they chose, uncovering the human moments that linger beyond the headlines. Marian Bowman Jr. Marian Bowman Jr. was put to death on January 31, 2025, at the Broad River Correctional Institution in South Carolina by lethal injection. From the outset of his case, Bowman maintained he was innocent of the 2001 murder of 21-year-old Candy Martin, and his family and defense team argued prosecutorial misconduct and racial bias permeated his trial. On that winter evening, at 6:27 p.m., after receiving a dose of pentobarbital, he was pronounced dead, marking the first execution in the United States for 2025 and South Carolina's first since the fall of 2024. His capture occurred shortly after the fire was reported, when police traced a lead to Bowman based on cell phone records and a tip from a cooperating witness, who later received a sentence reduction for testifying. He was arrested in February 2001 at a relative's home, taken into custody without incident, and charged with murder, arson, and possession of a firearm in the commission of a violent crime. During trial, the prosecution's case relied heavily on the testimony of 2 witnesses who claimed Bowman confessed, and on ballistic and fire scene reconstructions, painting a picture of a jealous altercation that ended in murder. Bowman's defense challenged the credibility of those witnesses, argued his counsel was unprepared, and pointed to withheld evidence that might have cast doubt on the timeline. The jury returned a guilty verdict on February 28, 2002, by a 12-0 vote, sentencing him to death. On execution day, Bowman's funeral-style last meal request comprised fried shrimp, fish, oysters, chicken wings and tenders, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, pineapple juice, and cranberry juice. Witnesses included his attorney, several family members, and members of the victim's family who attended to see justice served. No last-minute stays interrupted the proceedings, despite Bowman's public appeals for drug protocol transparency. Bowman's final words, conveyed through his lawyer, were a firm declaration of innocence. "I did not kill Candy Martin. I'm innocent of the crimes I'm here to die for," followed by a message of condolences to Martin's loved ones and a critique of the justice system's treatment of death row inmates. His tone blended remorse for the pain caused and defiance at his conviction, framing his death as a testament to a flawed process. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. On February 5, 2025, Stephen LaWayne Nelson, 37, was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas, becoming the second person put to death in the U.S. that year. Convicted of capital murder in the 2011 killing of Reverend Clint Dobson in Arlington, Nelson had spent nearly 13 years on death row after a jury found him guilty in October 2012. Nelson's crime unfolded in January 2011, when he entered North Point Baptist Church and attacked Pastor Dobson, strangling and suffocating him during what prosecutors described as a robbery gone violent. Judy Elliott, the church secretary, survived a severe beating and later identified Nelson in a photo lineup. Surveillance footage and blood spatter analysis further tied him to the scene. Following the homicide, fingerprints matching Nelson's were found on church property, and blood evidence was discovered on his sneakers after police obtained a search warrant. He was arrested on January 25, 2011, at his apartment without incident, formally charged with capital murder and aggravated assault, and held without bail amid media attention. At trial, the the prosecution presented E.J. Dobson's daughter and forensic experts who detailed the ligature marks and DNA evidence, arguing Nelson intended to kill for financial gain. The defense asserted he acted as a lookout and lacked intent, while also raising an insanity defense supported by testimony on his mental health history. The jury returned a guilty verdict and a death sentence on October 12, 2012, unanimously voting 12-0. Nelson's appeals focused on claims of ineffective counsel and newly discovered evidence suggesting the robbery angle was exaggerated. State courts upheld the conviction, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined review on February 5, 2025. Here's Part 2, covering the next 4 executions of 2025 in the same narrative, documentary-style format, with each case presented as a seamless story without bulleted lists. Demetrius Terrence Frasier. In the late afternoon of February 6, 2025, the steel doors of Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, clanged shut one final time behind 52-year-old Demetrius Terrence Frasier. For over 3 decades, Frasier had roamed the halls of 2 prison systems, first in Michigan for a shocking 1992 slaying of 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick, and then in Alabama for the 1991 rape and murder of 40-year-old Pauline Brown. Investigators had tracked him to Birmingham through eyewitness accounts and his own DNA, which matched evidence lifted from Brown's apartment door frame and a dropped cigarette butt at the scene. When officers obtained a warrant, they found blood-stained sneakers in his Detroit home, an ominous echo of the broken home and childhood abuse that prosecutors painted as Frasier's early life backdrop. Charged with capital murder, Frasier was indicted in June 1996, and despite his defense team's plea that childhood trauma and psychosis merited life terms rather than death, a jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict the following year. Over the next 28 years, he filed appeal after appeal, citing ineffective counsel and new questions over the nitrogen hypoxia protocol that Alabama intended to use. But state courts, the 11th Circuit, and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. On that February evening, witnesses described mounting tension as the nitrogen canister hissed its way into the sealed chamber. At 6:36 p.m., after roughly 25 minutes, Frasier's chest went still. When the warden signed the death certificate, reporters noted the grim milestone, Alabama's 4th use of nitrogen gas, a method still shadowed by medical uncertainty. Before the procedure, Frasier requested a last meal of tacos, chalupas, tacos de pollo, chips, and queso, and a Mountain Dew, comfort food from the Taco Bell next door to his childhood home in Detroit. He shared it in silence with his mother and sister, who later recalled his whispered apology to Pauline Brown's family. Frasier's final words, delivered through his attorney, were at once contrite and challenging. "I'm sorry for what happened, and I hope this sparks more honesty about how we punish the damned." James Dennis Ford. Just a week later, on February 13th, the Florida State Prison in Rayford became the stage for an execution that had been 2 decades in the making. 64-year-old James Dennis Ford had lain on Florida's death row since 1999, convicted in 1997 for the horrific bludgeoning, shooting, and rape of Gregory and Kimberly Malnery at a remote Charlotte County sod farm. A tiny witness, 2-year-old Miranda Malnery, was found hours later, blood-soaked and traumatized, clinging to her mother's lifeless body. Investigators pieced together Ford's path. Phone records lured the Malnorys to the farm. Forensic analysis tied his blood-spattered shirt to the scene, and his rifle, left behind in a panic, sealed his fate. At trial, the defense argued Ford's intellectual disability and unstable home life demanded leniency, but the jury saw cold calculation and returned a 12-0 vote for death. Over the years, appeals questioned counsel's preparedness, and sought relief under Roper v. Simmons, banning juvenile executions, but courts held firm. On the night of his death warrant, Ford opted not to speak. As the three-drug cocktail coursed through his veins at 6:19 p.m., media witnesses noted only the faintest tremor before his chest stilled. His written final statement, found clutched in his hand, read simply, "Hugs, prayers, love, God bless everyone." Earlier that day, Ford had requested a home-style last meal: steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato casserole, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea, which he ate alone in his cell with his sister by his side. Corrections officials later reported he lingered over the sweet potato, pausing to close his eyes in reflection before placing the fork down forever. Richard Lee Tabler. While Florida carried out its first execution of the year, Texas followed suit 1 hour later. At 6:38 p.m. Central Standard Time on February 13th, 46-year-old Richard Lee Tabler lay strapped to the gurney in Huntsville Unit's death chamber. His heart still beating with remorse he claimed he felt each morning. In November 2004, Tabler had unleashed a wave of terror across Leane. A Thanksgiving Day nightclub shooting that left 2 men dead, followed days later by the murders of 2 teenage dancers. His co-defendant received life without parole. Tabler received 2 death sentences. Fingerprint and ballistic evidence, coupled with surveillance footage, sealed his conviction in 2006. In the years that followed, Tabler vacillated, sometimes volunteering for execution, other times seeking stays, while his attorneys built a case around his PTSD from military service and long-standing mental health struggles. But no court would reverse itself. On that cold evening, Tabler glanced through the glass at the families of those he killed, then stared upward and offered a whispered apology. "I'm sorry for all I've done." His tone was subdued, heavy with regret. Minutes later, the needle plunged and Tabler slipped away. For his final meal, he chose a modest plate: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, chocolate pudding, and a Dr. Pepper. After eating, he leaned back against his pillow and closed his eyes, telling his spiritual advisor, "I feel ready." Brad Keith Sigman. On March 7th, South Carolina reintroduced an execution method unseen in the U.S. for 15 years. At 6:05 p.m. in the Broad River Correctional Institution, 67-year-old Brad Keith Sigman lay hooded and strapped to a wooden chair. In 2001, he had broken into the home of his ex-girlfriend's parents and bludgeoned them to death with a baseball bat, a crime so personal it shocked community and court alike. In the sterile calm before the shots, Sigman mouthed a final reflection to his lawyer: "End this now." Then 3 volunteers raised .308 rifles and fired. Witnesses described a single volley, a spray of crimson, and Sigman's body twisting twice before going still at 6:08 p.m. An autopsy later revealed the bullets struck below the heart, raising agonizing questions about undue suffering. Sigman's last meal was a Southern feast: a bucket of fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, biscuits, sweet tea, and cheesecake. Reports conflicted on whether his request for multiple buckets was granted, but corrections staff noted he shared small pieces of chicken with cellmates in the hour before his death. Minutes before the volley, he spoke into a microphone so family and press could hear, "I pray this ends the death penalty. No one but God should have the power over life and death." His final words, half protest and half plea, hung in the cold South Carolina twilight as the firing squad laid down their rifles. Here is part 3 of our series, covering the next 4 executions of 2025. Each section unfolds the story of the crime, capture, trial, and execution, before delving into the inmate's final words and last meal. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr.'s life ended on March 18, 2025, at Louisiana State Penitentiary, known to many as Angola, in a historic first use of nitrogen hypoxia in that state. Hoffman, 46, had been convicted in 1996 for the brutal rape and murder of 24-year-old Mary Molly Elliott in Ascension Parish. On that January night, Hoffman, then only 18, had accosted Elliott as she walked home, forced her into nearby woods, and ended her life in an act of senseless violence that shocked the community. Within hours, detectives followed a trail of physical evidence. Hoffman's fingerprints on Elliott's car door and semen samples in a nearby field, to the home of his uncle, where Hoffman was arrested without resistance. The ensuing trial hinged on forensic breakthroughs, fiber analysis, DNA matching, and ballistic tests that linked Hoffman's gun to a spent cartridge at the scene. Despite defense pleas highlighting his troubled upbringing and claims of ineffective counsel, the jury returned a unanimous death sentence in late 1996. Over nearly 3 decades on death row, Hoffman filed numerous appeals, contesting the constitutionality of nitrogen hypoxia and citing new scientific concerns over the method's humanness. His lawyers argued that depriving oxygen via pure nitrogen breached the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Yet every court, including the U.S. Supreme Court, refused to intervene. On execution day, Hoffman declined a final meal and offered no last statement. Witnesses described a tense 19-minute ordeal behind a full-face mask, during which he convulsed and jerked, raising fresh debate over the protocol's cruelty. At 6:50 p.m., the West Feliciana Parish coroner pronounced him dead, marking a controversial chapter in America's use of experimental execution methods. Aaron Brian Gunches. The sun had barely risen at 10:33 a.m. on March 19, 2025, when Arizona carried out its first execution in over 2 years. Aaron Brian Gunches, 53, lay strapped to the gurney at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, his arms already tinged by IV insertion deep in his femoral arteries, a change in procedure prompted by past botched executions. Convicted for the 2002 desert killing of Ted Price, 40, Gunches's crime unfolded after Price began living with Gunches's ex-girlfriend, igniting a violent showdown that ended with Price's death from a single gunshot to the head. Police zeroed in on Gunches through surveillance footage of his truck near the crime scene and ballistic matches between the recovered bullet and his confiscated handgun. After taking him into custody, investigators also found a history of stalking and threats, which prosecutors used to paint a portrait of premeditation. At his 2007 trial, Gunches pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The jury swiftly imposed the death penalty. Over the years, Gunches himself pushed for his execution, arguing that remaining on death row served no purpose. His last-minute appeals centered on Arizona's execution protocols, but Governor Katie Hobbs ultimately refused to stay. On the morning of March 19th, witnesses watched in silence as pentobarbital coursed through his veins. For his final meal, Gunches ordered aggressively indulgent fare: a double Western bacon cheeseburger, fries, a spicy gyro, a BBQ gyro, onion rings, and baklava for dessert, sourced from nearby Carl's Jr. and local bakeries. He ate quietly, declining to look at witnesses or offer a parting statement, his last moments marked by a palpable stillness in the witness room. Wendell Ardan Grysom. Oklahoma's first execution of 2025 came on March 20th at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where Wendell Ardan Grysom faced the gurney for his role in a 2005 home invasion murder. Grysom, 56, had broken into the Watonga residence of Amber Dawn Matthews and her companion, Drew Kopp, shooting Matthews multiple times and leaving Kopp for dead before fleeing into the night. Investigators captured Grysom days later by matching his DNA to blood evidence found at the scene and tracing surveillance footage of him purchasing a firearm shortly after the crime. At trial, the prosecution leveraged eyewitness testimony and forensic experts to argue Grysom's intent, while the defense pointed to a history of drug addiction and mental instability. The jury's 12-0 verdict in 2006 ensured his place on death row. Behind bars, Grysom oscillated between remorse and defiance. His clemency petition spoke of religious transformation. Survivors like Kopp testified to ongoing trauma and urged Oklahoma's Pardon and Parole Board to show mercy. Yet the board upheld the death warrant and federal courts refused to intervene. On execution day, Grysom requested a final meal of a Canadian bacon supreme pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a pint of Coca-Cola. Comfort foods, he said, reminded him of simpler times. His last words, offered in a subdued apology to the Matthews and Kopp families, "I'm sorry for what I did and the pain I caused," echoed through the witness chamber before the lethal injection silenced him at 10:13 a.m. Edward Thomas James. That same day in Florida, Edward Thomas James, 63, faced his final sunrise at Florida State Prison near Stark. In September 1993, James had bludgeoned 8-year-old Toni Neuner and her grandmother, Betty Dick, 58, during a botched home burglary in Seminole County. 2 lives ended in an act of callous violence that left the community reeling. Authorities built an airtight case. James's fingerprints on a broken window, boot print impressions on the floor, and a glove discarded nearby. He pleaded guilty in 1995 to 2 counts of first-degree murder, waiving the right to challenge the death penalty in exchange for expedited proceedings. Over the next 30 years, his appeals touched on intellectual disability claims and procedural errors, but none gained traction in state or federal courts. On March 20th at 8:15 p.m., James received a 3-drug injection in the execution chamber. He declined to speak, his breathing growing shallow as the drugs took effect. His final meal request was modest: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, chocolate pudding, and iced tea, homey fare he shared with a single chaplain before the curtains closed. As the 4th lines emptied, James's body relaxed, and at precisely 8:22 p.m., the warden pronounced him dead. No last words were offered, but the empty cell and silent chamber stood as testament to a life ended by the very justice he once evaded. Below is Part 4, covering the final 5 executions of 2025 so far. Each narrative flows seamlessly through the crime, capture, trial, execution, last words, and final meal, with up-to-date cited details. Mikall Anthony Tanzy. On April 8, 2025 at exactly 6:12 p.m., Mikall Anthony Tanzy, 59, lay strapped to the gurney at Florida State Prison in Rayford, where he met his end by lethal injection for the brutal April 2000 strangling of Janet Acosta, a Miami Herald production worker he abducted from her truck, drove to the Florida Keys, and murdered before abandoning her body on a deserted island. Investigators zeroed in on Tanzy through tire track analysis, linking his van to the crime scene and Acosta's credit card found in his apartment. At his 2002 trial, prosecutors presented fiber evidence and Acosta's blood spatter testimony from surviving witnesses, while the defense argued diminished capacity, an argument the jury unanimously rejected in a swift guilty verdict. Tanzy's appeals contended prosecutorial misconduct and challenged Florida's drug protocol but failed at every level, including the U.S. Supreme Court. His clemency petition to Governor Ron DeSantis was denied just hours before the execution. In his final statement, uttered so faintly it barely reached witnesses, he apologized to Acosta's family and recited a passage from Romans, invoking divine mercy before the drugs halted his heartbeat. For his last meal, Tanzy requested fried shrimp, baked chicken, macaroni and cheese, key lime pie, and orange soda, comfort dishes he shared with his sister in a silent cell, closing his eyes between each bite. Mikall Dean Motti. Less than 72 hours later, on April 11th at Broad River Correctional Institution, 6:01 p.m., 42-year-old Mikall Dean Motti became the second South Carolina inmate executed by firing squad since January 2025. Convicted of the 2004 murder of off-duty officer James Myers during a violent crime spree, Motti's case relied on his own confession to accomplices and ballistic matches tying his rifle to the fatal shot. After choosing the firing squad over lethal injection or electrocution, fearing a prolonged death, Motti spent 2 decades filing appeals over his PTSD claims and mental health defenses, all rejected by state and federal courts. His execution drew controversy when an autopsy revealed only 2 of the expected 3 bullets struck him, missing the heart and causing excruciating conscious pain for up to a minute, far longer than protocol allows. Lawmakers and human rights groups now call for a review of South Carolina's death penalty procedures, arguing Motti's agonizing death violated the 8th Amendment. Motti declined a final meal and made no last statement, but witnesses heard groans and pleas for mercy echo through the chamber, igniting renewed debate over the humanity of firing squad executions. Moises Sandoval Mendoza. On April 23, 2025, at 6:40 p.m., the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville witnessed the execution of 41-year-old Moises Sandoval Mendoza by lethal injection after his 2004 conviction for the burglary and murder of former classmate Rochelle Tolleson. Surveillance footage placed Mendoza at Tolleson's apartment complex, and a fingerprint on a broken window pane, along with DNA under his victim's fingernails, sealed his guilt. During his 2006 trial, forensic pathologists detailed lethal blunt force injuries to Tolleson's skull, and his own recorded admission during police interrogation left no doubt in the jury's mind, resulting in a unanimous death sentence. In the hours before his death, Mendoza met privately with his pastor and wrote letters of apology to Tolleson's family. On the gurney, he offered a brief statement. "I'm sorry for having robbed you of Rochelle's life," delivering a contrite apology before the drugs-induced unconsciousness. His final meal, enchiladas, rice and beans, vanilla ice cream and a Sprite, was eaten quietly, each bite a solemn farewell to the world he had wronged. James Lee Osgood. Alabama's death chamber at the Holman Correctional Facility held a different scene on April 24, 2025, when 55-year-old James Lee Osgood received a 3-drug cocktail for the 2010 rape and murder of Tracy Lynn Brown. Osgood's conviction hinged on his DNA found on Brown's lingerie and surveillance footage of him entering and leaving her Chilton County home, despite his late-stage confession in 2019 requesting execution over continued appeals. His legal team had fought claims of ineffective counsel and challenged the use of pentobarbital, but every court refused to overturn his sentence. As attorneys and family watched, Osgood spoke softly through the glass. "Tell my children I love them. I'm ready," before the 4th line began its lethal course. For his last meal, he chose a classic Southern spread: fried pork chops, collard greens, cornbread, banana pudding, and sweet tea, eaten with few words and a steady resolve. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson. The most recent execution on May 1, 2025, at Florida State Prison, saw 62-year-old Gulf War veteran Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson put to death for the 1998 shotgun murders of his girlfriend, Renee Flaherty, and her 3 children. Hutchinson's trial featured gunshot residue evidence, forensic analysis of shell casings, and a disputed 911 call, elements his defense repeatedly challenged as indications of brain injury-induced delusion, all to no avail. His final appeals argued PTSD and cognitive impairment, but both the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court denied relief. As the lethal drugs flowed at 8 p.m., Hutchinson offered no formal last words but was observed mumbling incoherently and shaking before falling silent. He had requested a last meal of salmon, asparagus, baked potato, and iced tea, a modest menu reflecting his quiet composure in the face of death. These men's final moments, echoed in their parting words and meals, remind us that behind each execution lies a human story of crime, punishment, and consequence. As 15 inmates have been executed far in 2025 across 6 states, these solemn chapters challenge us to confront the morality and efficacy of America's sanction. Ultimately, these stories force a reckoning with our justice system's gravest act,